3 years ago, on a cold November night in downtown Chicago, a billionaire stood beside a hospital window staring at the woman he loved as machines slowly counted down the final moments of her life. Less than 48 hours later, her death was ruled an accident. No investigation, no arrests, no questions. The media moved on, the company's stock climbed higher, and Ethan Blackwood buried himself inside a billion-dollar empire built on silence. But what nobody knew was that hidden inside that tragedy was a secret capable of destroying one of the most powerful business families in America. And the woman who would eventually uncover that secret was not a journalist, a detective, or a lawyer. She was a struggling waitress who lost everything in a single night. Danielle Brooks did not look like someone whose life was about to collide with a billionaire's world. At 29 years old, she was exhausted in a way most people never truly understand. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones after years of surviving instead of living. Every morning she woke up before sunrise, worked double shifts at a restaurant near downtown Chicago, then spent her nights taking care of her younger sister Ava, whose medical condition had already buried the family under thousands of dollars in hospital debt. Most people who saw Danielle at work remembered her smile before they remembered anything else. Customers liked her because she was polite, calm, and patient even when people treated her badly. But behind that smile was a woman carrying the weight of an entire family alone. The night everything changed began with rain. Heavy rain. The kind that turns city streets into mirrors of flashing headlights and blurred reflections. Danielle had already been having the worst week of her life. Her landlord had threatened eviction. Ava's medication prices had increased again. And earlier that same day, Danielle discovered that her ex-boyfriend had emptied the small savings account they had once planned to use for a future together. 5 years of trust disappeared in less than 10 minutes. Still, she showed up to work because people like Danielle do not have the luxury of falling apart. But around 9:40 p.m., a wealthy customer accused her of stealing an expensive watch that had gone missing during dinner service. The restaurant manager did not ask questions. He did not review cameras. He simply chose the side of the richer man in the room. And just like that, Danielle lost her job in front of an entire crowded restaurant. She walked out into the storm trying not to cry because she already knew what losing that job meant. No rent, no medicine, no electricity, no food. Some moments in life do not feel real while they are happening. They feel distant, almost like watching somebody else's nightmare unfold from far away. Danielle stood outside the restaurant soaked by rain, clutching her bag against her chest while traffic rushed past her. And then, for one brief second, she stopped paying attention to the road. The black Rolls-Royce appeared almost out of nowhere, tires screeching against the wet pavement as the driver slammed the brakes hard enough to stop inches from her body. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The back door of the car opened slowly, and Ethan Blackwood stepped out into the rain. By that point, almost everyone in America knew his name. Billionaire investor, real estate giant, owner of Blackwood Holdings, one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. Business magazines called him ruthless. Financial analysts called him brilliant. Former employees called him impossible to read. But standing there in the middle of the storm, staring at the terrified woman frozen in front of his car, Ethan looked less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying years of sleepless nights behind his eyes. Danielle immediately recognized him, though she wished she had not. Men like Ethan Blackwood belonged to a world completely separate from hers. A world of private jets, penthouses, and security teams. A world where people never worried about overdue bills or empty refrigerators. "You could have been killed," Ethan said quietly. Danielle apologized immediately even though she had done nothing wrong. That was the first thing Ethan noticed about her. Even humiliated, exhausted, and standing in the rain after losing everything, she still carried herself with dignity. Most people in desperate situations begged for help the moment they recognized him. Danielle did the opposite. She tried to leave, but before she could take another step, her knees gave out beneath her. Ethan caught her before she hit the pavement. Hours later, Danielle woke up inside one of the most expensive penthouses in Chicago with a doctor checking her blood pressure and a stranger informing her that Ethan Blackwood insisted she stay the night because she had collapsed from exhaustion and severe stress. Everything about the situation felt unreal. The marble floors, the quiet hallways, the view of the city stretching endlessly through massive glass windows. It looked like the kind of place people only saw in movies. But what disturbed Danielle most was Ethan himself. He barely spoke. He watched people carefully before answering questions, as if every conversation was a negotiation happening inside his head. And despite the wealth surrounding him, there was something painfully lonely about the man. The next morning, Ethan asked Danielle to breakfast. What began as a simple conversation slowly became something far stranger. Ethan asked about her family, her sister, her financial situation, and her future plans with a level of attention Danielle had not experienced in years. He listened carefully, not out of politeness, out of genuine interest. And then, without warning, he made an offer that changed both their lives forever. Ethan explained that according to the final conditions of his grandfather's estate, he needed to be legally married within 6 months, or he would lose controlling ownership of Blackwood Holdings to the company's board. Danielle thought he was joking at first. Billionaires did not propose business marriages to waitresses. But Ethan remained completely serious. He offered her a 1-year marriage contract worth millions of dollars. In exchange, Danielle would appear publicly as his wife until the inheritance process was complete. Her sister's medical bills would be fully paid, her debts erased, her future secured. There were rules attached to the agreement. Strict rules. No discussing his personal past. No entering certain parts of the mansion. No interviews. No emotional attachment. Danielle should have walked away immediately. Every instinct told her the arrangement was dangerous. But desperation changes people. And when Ethan quietly admitted that someone connected to his late fiancée had recently begun threatening him again, Danielle realized this arrangement involved far more than money. Because 3 years after Claire Donovan's death, Ethan Blackwood still looked at her photographs like a man haunted by something he could never escape. What Danielle did not know was that hidden somewhere inside Ethan's world were secrets powerful enough to destroy careers, fortunes, and lives. And before this story was over, she would uncover the truth about the woman who died, the men who lied, and the billionaire who had spent years trying to outrun guilt that refused to stay buried. Ethan Blackwood did not become one of the most powerful billionaires in America by acting on emotion. Every deal he made was calculated, every partnership strategic, every risk measured down to numbers and percentages most people could never understand. But this time, the decision he made had nothing to do with business expansion or market control. It had to do with inheritance. A clause buried inside his grandfather's will that demanded something unexpected: a legally recognized wife within 6 months, or control of Blackwood Holdings would be stripped from him and handed over to a board of investors waiting for his downfall. On paper, it looked like pressure from family legacy. But for Ethan, it was something far more complicated than that, because Ethan Blackwood never did anything without a reason people could not immediately see. And the woman he chose was Danielle Brooks, a waitress with mounting medical debt, a sister battling illness, and a life that had already been crushed by financial pressure long before she ever met him. To the public, Danielle was irrelevant. To Ethan, she was a solution. At least that is what he told himself when he offered her the contract. A marriage without love, without public expectations, and without emotional involvement. Just structure, just control, just silence around anything personal. But control is never absolute, especially when 2 lives are forced into the same space under conditions neither fully understands. Because what Danielle did not know was that Ethan Blackwood's past was not empty. It was sealed, locked behind layers of silence that began long before she ever stepped into his penthouse. And at the center of it all was Claire Donovan, his late fiancée, whose death 3 years earlier was ruled as an accident within hours. No public investigation, no criminal case, no unanswered press conferences. Just closure. Too quickly, too cleanly, too perfectly. But perfection always raises questions. And inside Blackwood Mansion, those questions had never truly disappeared. Why does Ethan Blackwood need a wife urgently, when he has avoided every public relationship since Claire's death? What really happened to Claire Donovan on the night she died? And why was the case sealed almost immediately despite her connection to one of the most powerful men in Chicago? Is Danielle Brooks safe inside Blackwood Mansion? Or has she unknowingly stepped into something she was never meant to see? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, is Ethan Blackwood protecting her from the truth, or using her as a carefully positioned piece in a plan that began long before she ever entered his life? Because nothing inside that mansion exists without purpose. Not the silence, not the rules, not even the locked West Wing that Danielle was warned never to enter. At first, Danielle believed the marriage was only a contract. Then she discovered the hidden room. Danielle Brooks had learned early that survival does not announce itself with dramatic moments. It builds quietly, in small sacrifices repeated every single day until they become a way of life. In a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, she moved through each morning with precision born from exhaustion. The fridge was often nearly empty, not because she was careless, but because every dollar had already been assigned before it even arrived. Rent, utilities, her younger sister Ava's medication, school supplies when possible. Everything had a place, and none of those places included comfort for herself. Ava's condition meant hospital visits were constant, unpredictable, and expensive in a way that never seemed to decrease no matter how many bills were paid. Danielle learned to measure time not in days or weeks, but in due dates, prescriptions, and overdue notices. Between double shifts at a downtown restaurant, she rushed from work to home, checking Ava's breathing, adjusting blankets, preparing meals when energy allowed, and falling asleep in whatever moment her body finally refused to continue. She had applied for better jobs more times than she could count. Reception roles, administrative positions, anything that promised stability. But every interview ended the same way. A polite smile, a handshake, and a sentence that sounded almost rehearsed. "We'll be in touch." She stopped believing in that sentence a long time ago. Still, she showed up to work. Still, she smiled at customers. Still, she apologized when things went wrong even when they were not her fault. Because Danielle Brooks understood something most people never fully grasp. Some people are born into safety, and others fight for it every single morning just to survive the night. Ethan Blackwood's world did not resemble hers in any measurable way. It was a world built above the city, where glass towers reflected clouds instead of alleyways, and where silence cost more than noise. Boardrooms filled with executives who waited for his approval like it was oxygen. Private jets that crossed time zones without permission from anything as ordinary as traffic. Mansions so large they echoed even when occupied. But even inside that world, Ethan moved like someone who never fully belonged to it. The Blackwood estate was a place of contradiction. Expensive art on walls that felt untouched. Long corridors that stayed too quiet. Rooms that looked lived in, but never warm. And at the center of it all was Ethan himself, often alone at night, eating meals he'd barely tasted, staring at reports he had already memorized, surrounded by wealth that no longer seemed to impress him. What the public never understood was that Ethan Blackwood's empire was not just built on ambition. It was built on a condition written into his grandfather's final will. A legal requirement that forced him into marriage within 6 months or risk losing control of Blackwood holdings entirely. On the surface, it sounded like a family tradition designed to preserve legacy. But for Ethan, it felt more like a trap designed to force him back into a world he had already emotionally abandoned. Because long before the will was ever read, Ethan had already experienced something that changed him permanently. Claire Donovan. She was not just a name in old articles or forgotten headlines. She was the woman he was supposed to marry. The woman whose future had once been planned down to wedding invitations that were never sent. And then she was gone. Officially recorded as a sudden accident. Quiet. Clean. Final. No trial. No suspects. No meaningful explanation that ever made public sense. After her death, Ethan changed in ways people noticed but never fully understood. He stopped attending certain events. He removed himself from social circles that once defined him. He built distance between himself and anyone who got too close. Emotional attachment, in his world, became something dangerous rather than meaningful. And somewhere inside Blackwood Mansion, there was one space no one was allowed to enter. A locked room. No explanation given. No exceptions made. Not even for staff who had worked there for years. There were also things that did not fit neatly into explanation. Security cameras positioned in places that suggested monitoring beyond normal protection. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly whenever anyone entered the room. And a pattern of behavior that suggested Ethan was not just avoiding his past, he was guarding it. Then came Danielle Brooks, a waitress with no connection to his world, no influence, and no reason to ever cross paths with him under normal circumstances. Yet, on the night everything shifted, she collapsed in front of his car during a rainstorm after losing her job and nearly losing what little stability she had left. And Ethan Blackwood did something he was not known for doing. He stopped. He intervened. And within hours, he made her an offer that sounded less like romance and more like a business transaction carefully designed to solve a problem only he seemed to fully understand. A marriage contract. A temporary arrangement. A controlled agreement meant to satisfy inheritance conditions and nothing more. At least, that is what it was supposed to be. But in stories like this, nothing stays simple for long. Because the moment Danielle Brooks stepped into Ethan Blackwood's world, she was no longer just a stranger surviving on the outside. She was now inside the system that held all his secrets. And she had not yet been told what she was really walking into. The agreement between Ethan Blackwood and Danielle Brooks was never presented as anything emotional. It was structured like a contract meant to solve a problem that neither side wanted to explain fully out loud. Ethan made it clear from the beginning that this was not a real marriage in the traditional sense. It was a legal arrangement designed to satisfy the conditions of his grandfather's will, nothing more. The terms were precise. Danielle would move into Blackwood Mansion. She would present herself publicly as Ethan's wife during business events, charity galas, and private gatherings that required appearances to maintain his public image. In return, Ethan would clear her family's medical debt, secure ongoing treatment for her sister Ava, and provide financial stability that Danielle had never experienced in her entire life. But there were rules. Strict ones. She was not allowed to enter his private office under any circumstance. She was never to ask about Claire Donovan. And most importantly, she was never to develop emotional attachment to him. Ethan said those words with the same calm tone he used in board meetings. Controlled. Detached. Final. Danielle agreed, not because she believed in the arrangement, but because survival rarely gives people perfect choices. At first, the mansion felt like another world entirely. Danielle moved through rooms filled with silence and expensive design that felt more like a display than a home. She attended gatherings where she was surrounded by people who measured worth in watches, stock portfolios, and private connections. At those events, she often felt invisible even while standing beside Ethan Blackwood. But something unusual began to happen. Ethan, who was known for keeping emotional distance, started reacting differently when she was around. At public events, when subtle remarks were made about her background, he corrected people immediately. When journalists tried to corner her with invasive questions, he stepped in without hesitation. Slowly, without explanation, he began treating her presence as something worth protecting. And Danielle noticed it, not in a romantic way at first, but in a way that confused her understanding of who Ethan Blackwood was supposed to be. Because men like him were not supposed to care. Then came the first signs that something else was happening beneath the surface. Danielle began noticing details that did not fit the image of a clean, controlled billionaire household. Ethan received messages late at night that he deleted without responding. His expression would change slightly after reading them. Not fear exactly, but something closer to caution. Security around the mansion increased without explanation. Staff members lowered their voices whenever Claire Donovan's name was accidentally mentioned, as if even speaking it carried consequences. And there was one more thing Danielle could not ignore. A hallway on the upper floor that remained unusually restricted. No guests were allowed near it. Certain doors were always locked. Cameras were positioned in ways that suggested observation of more than just security. And Ethan himself would pause for a fraction of a second whenever he passed that section of the house, as if remembering something he refused to acknowledge. Danielle told herself it was none of her business. But curiosity does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. It grows in silence. The turning point came on a night that began like every other. Ethan was away at a private business meeting. The mansion was unusually quiet, and Danielle found herself walking through the upper floor alone. She had no intention of breaking rules. At least, that is what she believed at the time. But then she saw it. A door slightly ajar at the end of the restricted hallway. Her hesitation lasted only a moment. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the house. Not physically, but emotionally. It felt untouched, preserved, like something that had been sealed away rather than lived in. And what she found inside made her stop completely. Photographs. Dozens of them. Some old, some recent. All of Claire Donovan. Medical files stacked carefully in a locked drawer. Reports she was never meant to see. Records that suggested Claire's final days were not as simple as the public story had claimed. And then the footage. A screen still active, paused on a moment that made Danielle's stomach tighten. Claire Donovan arguing with Ethan's business partner, the same man who still appeared in Blackwood Holdings' executive meetings. The conversation looked intense, heated, fear visible in Claire's expression. And then the timestamp. Hours before her death. Danielle stepped back slowly, realizing what she was looking at was not just private information. It was evidence. Real, disturbing, unanswered evidence. Her breath caught as the weight of it settled in. Because everything she had been told about Claire Donovan, everything the world had accepted as truth, suddenly felt incomplete. And then she heard it. Footsteps outside the room. Ethan was back. Danielle turned slowly toward the door, heart racing, the screen still glowing behind her as the footage continued looping silently in the background. And in that moment, one thought formed in her mind that changed everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. Claire didn't die in an accident. Danielle Brooks did not run immediately after what she saw in the hidden room. Fear would have been the natural reaction, but confusion kept her rooted in place longer than it should have. Claire Donovan's footage replayed in her mind repeatedly. The argument, the tension, the presence of Ethan Blackwood's business partner Marcus Reed standing too calmly beside her in those final hours before everything changed. Nothing about it matched the story the world had been told. That night, when Ethan returned to Blackwood Mansion, Danielle made a decision she could not easily reverse. She did not confront him. She did not reveal what she found. Instead, she began doing something far more dangerous inside a household built on control. She started investigating quietly. At first, it was subtle. She checked old news reports from Claire Donovan's death. She searched archived articles. She looked for inconsistencies in timelines, names, and official statements. The more she looked, the more gaps she found. Statements that contradicted each other. Witness accounts that disappeared from later reports. References to investigations that were closed faster than they should have been. Then she began noticing patterns inside the mansion itself. Security footage logs that did not align with Ethan's travel schedule. Phone records that showed repeated late-night calls between Marcus Reed and individuals connected to financial departments inside Blackwood Holdings. And folders that seemed intentionally misplaced, as if someone inside the system was allowing access without openly admitting it. Every answer she found created two more questions. And the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. Outside the mansion, Danielle's behavior began to shift. Ethan noticed it first. The way she paused slightly longer before answering simple questions. The way her attention drifted when certain names were mentioned. The way she stopped looking at him directly during conversations that used to feel natural. For Ethan Blackwood, who built his life on reading people carefully, it was impossible not to see that something had changed. And suspicion followed quickly. Because in Ethan's world, silence was never neutral. It was always meaningful. As Danielle continued digging, the story of Claire Donovan began to take a different shape. Financial records linked Marcus Reed to irregular transactions within Blackwood Holdings during the months leading up to Claire's death. Internal documents suggested Claire had discovered inconsistencies in corporate accounts, patterns that pointed toward large-scale financial fraud hidden within the company's upper structure. The closer she got to exposing it, the more isolated she became. And according to recovered communication logs, Marcus Reed had been aware of her findings long before the night she died. The implication was no longer abstract. It was precise. Claire had not simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had become a threat to someone powerful enough to control narratives after her death. And Ethan Blackwood, consumed by grief, had been easier to manage than anyone expected. But truth in isolation is never safe for long. Marcus Reed moved first. Danielle's growing curiosity was reframed within Ethan's circle as something far more damaging. A narrative was introduced quietly into the background conversations of staff, security, and advisors. That Danielle Brooks was not what she appeared to be. That her sudden presence in Ethan's life was not coincidence, but calculated intention. By the time Ethan heard it, the idea had already taken root. A gold digger, a spy, someone exploiting a vulnerable billionaire. And when Ethan finally confronted her, the emotional restraint he was known for completely collapsed. The confrontation happened inside Blackwood Mansion late at night. Ethan stood across from Danielle, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it before, every word carrying years of built-up mistrust and emotional suppression finally breaking through. "I paid you to stand beside me, not betray me." The words hit harder than anything financial or physical could have. Danielle tried to explain, tried to show him what she had found, tried to make him see that Marcus Reed was not just involved, but central to a pattern that went far deeper than either of them understood. But Ethan was not listening anymore. Not fully. Because once suspicion enters a system built on control and grief, it does not leave easily. Danielle realized that in that moment, she was no longer being heard as a person. She was being processed as a threat. And that was the moment everything broke. She left Blackwood Mansion that night without looking back. No protection. No explanation that had been fully understood. Just silence behind her as the doors closed. But what neither of them fully realized yet was this. Danielle Brooks was not the problem inside Ethan Blackwood's world. She was the only person still trying to uncover the truth that everyone else had already buried. And even after being pushed out, she was not done. Everything inside Blackwood Holdings began to collapse quietly at first, the way powerful systems often do when pressure starts building beneath the surface. Then suddenly, it became impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed moved first. A carefully crafted leak appeared across financial news outlets overnight, suggesting internal corruption inside Blackwood Holdings. Fake reports, distorted documents, and selectively edited transaction records were pushed into circulation. Within hours, analysts began questioning the stability of Ethan Blackwood's empire. Within days, it became a full public crisis. The visuals of Ethan's world changed almost overnight. News reporters gathered outside corporate buildings, speaking urgently into cameras about alleged misconduct. Stock market charts dipped sharply, red lines falling faster than anyone could stabilize. Protesters appeared outside Blackwood properties, shouting accusations they did not fully understand but had already accepted as truth. Investors pulled out. Board members went silent. And inside the mansion, Ethan Blackwood sat alone, watching everything he built begin to fracture in real time. No one had ever seen him like that before. Not defeated, not emotional, just still. But while chaos unfolded outside, Danielle Brooks was not finished. She had left the mansion, but she had not stopped searching. Everything she had learned about Claire Donovan, Marcus Reed, and the hidden structure inside Blackwood Holdings pointed to one missing piece. Something Claire had discovered but never lived long enough to fully expose. Then she found it. A hidden audio recording stored in an old encrypted file linked to Claire's personal devices. The file had been buried deep, mislabeled, almost designed to be forgotten. But once accessed, the truth inside it changed everything. Claire Donovan's voice. The recording was unstable, broken in places, but clear enough to understand the fear underneath every word. Claire spoke about Marcus Reed, about pressure, about financial manipulation happening inside Blackwood Holdings that she had uncovered too late. She described being followed, warned, cornered, and then came the part that changed everything. She said Ethan Blackwood had no idea. He was not part of the corruption. He was being kept away from it deliberately, and she was afraid that if she confronted it directly, she would not make it out safely. Danielle sat in silence after hearing it, because everything she had been blamed for, everything Ethan had accused her of, suddenly made no sense. She was not the intruder. She was the only one holding evidence of the truth. And Ethan Blackwood had pushed her away while trusting the very person responsible for destroying both Claire Donovan and his company from the inside. The case escalated quickly. A courtroom sequence began forming behind the scenes as legal teams moved in. Lawyers argued over financial records. Evidence was reintroduced. Documents that had been ignored for years were suddenly impossible to dismiss. Marcus Reed's involvement became harder to hide as inconsistencies began surfacing in official testimony. And then Ethan saw it. The truth about Danielle. She was not working against him. She was never the enemy. Everything she had done was connected to protecting him from a truth he had refused to see. For the first time, Ethan Blackwood began to understand the scale of what he had lost. During the legal breakdown, Marcus Reed attempted to regain control by distancing himself from Claire Donovan's case. But under pressure, details emerged that changed the entire narrative. The confrontation between Marcus and Claire had not been a simple argument. It had escalated. And during that confrontation, something irreversible happened. Something that directly led to the sequence of events resulting in Claire Donovan's death. Not accidental. Not random. A consequence of panic, control, and exposure of financial crimes that were never meant to be discovered. The emotional weight of the revelation hit Ethan harder than anything in his entire life. For years, he believed Claire's death was an accident he could not prevent. For years, he believed control had failed him. But now he understood something far more painful. He had been manipulated into isolation. And the one person he pushed away, the one person he accused, the one person he refused to listen to, was the only person trying to protect him from the truth all along. For the first time in public, Ethan Blackwood broke. Not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man realizing the cost of silence, trust misplaced, and truth ignored for too long. And as cameras captured the moment, his voice finally cracked under the weight of everything he could no longer hold back. The only person I pushed away was the one trying to protect me. The downfall of Marcus Reed did not happen quietly. Once the truth about Claire Donovan's death and the internal manipulation inside Blackwood Holdings fully surfaced, there was no way to contain it anymore. Evidence that had been buried for years finally connected into a single, undeniable chain. Financial fraud, corporate interference, witness intimidation, and the role Marcus Reed played in shaping the narrative that protected him while destroying others. Authorities moved in. Marcus Reed was arrested. But even with the arrest, the damage had already spread far beyond what the law could immediately repair. Ethan Blackwood did not escape the consequences. The public turned faster than his company could respond. Investors pulled out permanently. Long-standing partnerships were suspended. Headlines shifted from admiration to scrutiny. The empire he had built over years of control and precision began to fracture under the weight of exposure. Blackwood Holdings did not disappear overnight, but it was no longer untouchable. For the first time in his life, Ethan experienced something he had never prepared for. Loss that could not be negotiated. And yet, something unexpected happened within that collapse. For years, Ethan had lived inside control, isolation, and silence. Every decision had been designed to protect him from emotional risk. But the unraveling of everything forced him into a space he had avoided for most of his life. Truth without protection. And in that truth, something inside him began to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but honestly. Months passed. Life moved forward in ways that did not resemble the world Ethan Blackwood once controlled. Danielle Brooks did not return to the mansion. She did not rebuild her life in luxury. Instead, she created something far simpler. A small cafe on a quiet street in Chicago. No security gates. No private staff. No contracts. Just mornings filled with steady work, familiar faces, and a sense of peace she had never fully experienced before. It was not glamorous, but it was hers. One afternoon, as she arranged cups behind the counter, the bell above the cafe door rang. Danielle looked up, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Ethan Blackwood stood at the entrance. No security detail behind him. No expensive suit designed to project power. No distance between him and the life he had once lived in control of everything. Just him. Quiet. Uncertain. Human. He slowly walked inside, as if stepping into a world he no longer had authority over. Danielle did not speak immediately. Neither did he. Because for the first time, there were no contracts between them. No conditions. No arrangements designed to protect or control outcomes. Only truth. Ethan finally broke the silence. This time, no contracts. Danielle looked at him for a long moment. Not as a billionaire. Not as the man who once controlled her entire future. But as someone who had finally lost enough to understand what he never valued properly before. She smiled softly. And that was enough. Money can buy loyalty. It can buy silence. It can even buy power. But what Ethan Blackwood discovered too late was something far more important. The one thing he could never purchase was trust. And once it is broken, it cannot be controlled. It can only be earned again, or lost forever. Would you have trusted Ethan Blackwood after discovering the truth? The story of Ethan Blackwood and Danielle Brooks does not end with wealth restored or reputations repaired. It ends in something far more complicated. Two people who were forced into each other's lives by a contract, but reshaped by truth they could no longer ignore. Because sometimes the real question is not what you would do when everything is perfect. It is what you do when everything falls apart. Do you think Danielle Brooks should have forgiven Ethan Blackwood or walked away forever? And if you thought this billionaire story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened to the millionaire who disappeared the night before his wedding. Subscribe for more emotional billionaire mysteries and suspense stories inspired by real-life drama.